Before the gold-laden caravans of Mali crossed the Sahara, before Mansa Musa's pilgrimage dazzled the Islamic world, there existed an empire that few remember today. An empire that did not merely survive in the desert, it conquered it. An empire that transformed the endless dunes of the Sahara from a barrier into a highway of power, faith, and wealth. This is the story of the Almoravid dynasty, the veiled warriors who carved an empire from sand and steel, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Morocco to the golden cities of sub-Saharan Africa and north into the heart of Islamic Spain. This is the story of how Berber nomads became emperors, how religious fervor became military might, and how an entire civilization rose from the unforgiving desert to reshape the medieval world. The Sahara Desert in the 11th century was not the empty wasteland that many imagine. It was a living, breathing network of ancient trade routes, where caravans carrying salt, gold, slaves, and ideas moved like blood through the veins of Africa. The desert connected civilizations rather than separated them. To the north lay the fragmenting kingdoms of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, weakening under internal division and Christian pressure. To the south lay the wealthy trading cities of the Ghana Empire and the emerging Soninka kingdoms, growing rich on gold mines that seemed inexhaustible. And in between, controlling the arteries of trade, lived the Sanhaja Berbers, desert nomads who knew every water source, every safe passage, every secret of survival in this harsh landscape. These Sanhaja Berbers were not a unified people but a confederation of tribes, moving with their herds across territories that spanned hundreds of miles. They dressed in distinctive indigo veils that covered their faces, earning them names like the Veiled Ones among other peoples. The desert sun had forged them into extraordinary warriors and traders, men who could ride for days without water, who could navigate by stars and wind patterns, who could fight mounted on camels with devastating effectiveness. They were the masters of the Sahara, but they were not yet conquerors of empires. They were fragmented, divided by clan loyalties and tribal feuds, lacking the unifying vision that transforms scattered warriors into an unstoppable force. But in the heart of the Sahara, in the early decades of the 11th century, something was stirring. A spiritual awakening was beginning among these desert tribes, a religious movement that would soon ignite into military conquest. The catalyst was a man named Abdallah ibn Yassin, a Muslim scholar from the Sousse region of southern Morocco, a man whose zealous interpretation of Islamic law would become the ideological foundation of an empire. The story begins around 1035, when the leader of the Gudala tribe, one of the Sanhaja confederations, made a pilgrimage to Mecca. Upon his return, he was deeply troubled by what he perceived as the lax religious practices of his people. Yes, they were Muslims, but their Islam was mixed with older traditions, with practices that predated the Prophet's teachings. They prayed, but not with the strictness that the Quran demanded. They followed Islamic law, but loosely, adapting it to desert customs. The Gudala chief wanted purer faith, stricter adherence, a return to what he saw as authentic Islam. He invited religious scholars to come to the desert, to teach his people the correct way, to purify their practice. Most scholars refused. The desert was harsh, dangerous, far from the centers of Islamic learning in cities like Fez or Kairouan. But Abdallah ibn Yassin accepted. He was a member of the Maliki school of Islamic jurisprudence, known for its strict interpretation and its spread across North Africa. Ibn Yassin was not merely a teacher, he was a reformer with uncompromising vision. He traveled into the Sahara with fire in his heart, determined to transform these desert warriors into model Muslims. What Ibn Yassin found shocked him. He saw practices he considered heretical, customs he deemed un-Islamic, a society that needed not gentle guidance, but radical transformation. He began to preach with fierce intensity, demanding that the Sanhaja abandon their traditional ways, that they follow Islamic law in its strictest form, that they embrace jihad, holy struggle, both internal spiritual struggle and external military conquest against those who rejected true Islam. His message was uncompromising. Purify yourselves, unite under true faith, and spread that faith through all lands. At first, the desert tribes resisted. Ibn Yasin's demands were too extreme, too disruptive of their way of life. He banned music, regulated marriage practices strictly, imposed harsh punishments for violations of Islamic law, and insisted on absolute obedience to religious authority. The Gudala, who had invited him, eventually rejected him. They drove him away, unwilling to accept his radical vision. But Ibn Yasin did not give up. He withdrew to a ribat, a fortified religious compound, somewhere along the Senegal River, or perhaps on an island in that region. Historical sources vary on the exact location. There, he gathered a small group of devoted followers, men who accepted his vision completely, who were willing to submit to rigorous religious training and military discipline. This ribat became both a monastery and military academy, where faith and warfare were forged into a single purpose. These men called themselves Almoravitun, the people of the ribat, from which comes the name Almoravid. From this small beginning, with perhaps only a few dozen committed followers, Ibn Yasin began to build not just a religious movement, but a military force. He trained his disciples in both Quranic recitation and mounted combat, in Islamic law and desert warfare tactics. He instilled in them absolute loyalty to his interpretation of faith and absolute conviction in their mission to purify and unite the Berber tribes of the Sahara. These Almoravids were not merely soldiers, they were warrior monks, fighting men animated by religious zeal, believing themselves to be the instruments of divine will. By the early 1042s, Ibn Yasin judged his force ready. The Almoravids emerged from their ribat and began their campaign of conquest and conversion. They did not march as conquerors seeking plunder, but as religious reformers seeking to purify Islam across the desert. Their first targets were the tribes who had rejected Ibn Yasin's teachings. The Gudala, the Lamtuna, and other Sanhaja groups faced a choice: accept the strict Islamic reform that Ibn Yasin preached, or face holy war. The Almoravid military tactics were devastatingly effective. They fought mounted on camels and horses, using the mobility that centuries of desert life had perfected. They wore their distinctive veils, which served both practical purposes protecting against sand and sun, and psychological ones, making them appear mysterious and fearsome to enemies. Their religious conviction gave them extraordinary cohesion and discipline. While other armies might break under pressure or dispute over leadership, the Almoravids fought with unified purpose, seeing death in battle as martyrdom and victory as divine favor. Tribe after tribe submitted. Some converted willingly, genuinely moved by Ibn Yasin's preaching. Others converted at the point of a sword, recognizing that resistance was futile against this new force. Ibn Yasin was uncompromising with those who resisted. He imposed harsh penalties, confiscated property, and demanded complete submission to his religious authority. But he was also strategic, incorporating conquered tribes into his growing army, turning former enemies into devoted followers. The Almoravid movement grew like a sandstorm, gathering strength as it moved across the desert. By 1050, Ibn Yasin had unified most of the Sanhaja Berber tribes under Almoravid authority. But the spiritual leader recognized that his own skills lay in religious teaching and organizational leadership, not in commanding large military campaigns. He needed a general, a military mind that could translate religious fervor into strategic conquest. He found that man in Yahya ibn Umar al-Lamtuni, a chief of the Lamtuna tribe, who became the first military commander of the Almoravid armies. Under Yahya's leadership, the Almoravids began to look beyond the desert tribes toward richer targets, the trading cities and kingdoms that controlled the gold routes. Their first major external target was the city of Sijil Masa, a wealthy trading hub at the northern edge of the Sahara in what is now southern Morocco. Sijil Masa was a crucial node in trans-Saharan trade, where caravans from sub-Saharan Africa exchanged gold and slaves for salt, textiles, and manufactured goods from the north. The city was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and strategically vital. It was also, in the eyes of the Almoravids, insufficiently Islamic, governed by rulers who did not follow strict religious law. In 1054, the Almoravid army, now numbering in the thousands, attacked Sijil Masa. The city, unprepared for the religious and military storm that descended upon it, fell quickly. The Almoravids executed the ruling dynasty, installed their own governor, and imposed strict Islamic law on the population. They did not merely conquer Sijil Masa, they purified it, transforming it into an Almoravid city, the first major urban conquest of the desert warriors. But tragedy struck shortly after this victory. Yahya ibn Umar was killed in battle during a campaign against the Gudala tribe, who had resumed resistance against Almoravid authority. His death could have fragmented the movement, but instead, leadership passed to his brother, Abu Bakr ibn Umar, who proved to be an even more capable military leader. And alongside Abu Bakr rose a cousin, a man whose name would become synonymous with Almoravid power and whose conquests would create an empire, Yusuf ibn Tashfin. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was a different breed of leader. Where Ibn Yasin was a religious zealot and Abu Bakr a traditional tribal warrior, Yusuf combined religious devotion with political sophistication and strategic brilliance. He understood that the Almoravid movement could become more than a desert confederation. It could become a true empire with cities, institutions, and lasting power. He saw the weakness in the fragmented kingdoms to the north, in Morocco and Al-Andalus. He recognized that the wealth of sub-Saharan trade could finance larger ambitions. He had the vision to transform the religious movement into an imperial project. The partnership between Abu Bakr and Yusuf ibn Tashfin defined the next phase of Almoravid expansion. In 1056, they turned their attention northward, toward the heart of Morocco. They captured the city of Taroudant, then pushed further into the Atlas Mountains, conquering Berber tribes and small kingdoms that had long maintained independence. Their army grew with each victory, incorporating warriors from conquered territories, swelling into a force of tens of thousands. But their greatest prize lay ahead: the ancient city of Agmat, the capital of the Mazmuda Berber kingdom in the High Atlas region. Agmat was wealthy, cultured, and well defended. Its fall would open the way to the fertile plains of northern Morocco and the approaches to Al-Andalus. The Almoravid siege of Agmat in 1058 was a test of their military sophistication. These were no longer just desert raiders, they had learned siege warfare, logistics, and the art of conquering fortified cities. After months of pressure, Agmat surrendered. The Almoravids had crossed from the desert into the mountains and were now poised to descend into the rich valleys of Morocco. Then came a critical turning point in Almoravid history, a moment that transformed the movement's leadership structure and its ultimate direction. In 1060, rebellions erupted in the southern Sahara among tribes who resented Almoravid authority. Abu Bakr ibn Umar, as the primary leader of the movement, decided he must personally return to the desert to suppress these revolts and secure the southern territories. But who would command in the north, where the Almoravids were poised for their greatest conquests? Abu Bakr made a fateful decision. He appointed his cousin Yusuf ibn Tashfin as his deputy, giving him command of all Almoravid forces in Morocco. Some sources suggest Abu Bakr planned to return after pacifying the south. Others indicate he recognized that Yusuf was better suited to the complex political and military challenges of conquering Morocco and beyond. Whatever the intention, the result was clear. Abu Bakr rode south into the Sahara and would remain there for the rest of his life, fighting rebellious tribes and expanding Almoravid control over trade routes. He died in 1087 inches battle against African kingdoms south of the desert, his body buried somewhere in the sands he had spent his life fighting to control. Yusuf ibn Tashfin now stood alone as the supreme commander of the Almoravid forces in Morocco. He was approximately 40 years old, a seasoned warrior with dark skin weathered by years in the desert sun, eyes that observers described as piercing and intelligent, and a bearing that commanded natural respect. Unlike many conquerors who sought luxury and display, Yusuf maintained the austere lifestyle of a desert warrior, even as he built palaces and cities. He ate simple food, wore plain clothes, and lived according to the strict religious principles that Ibn Yasin had preached. But he possessed something that religious zealots often lack: political wisdom, strategic patience, and the ability to govern as well as conquer. Yusuf's first act as supreme leader was to establish a permanent capital for his growing empire. The existing cities of Morocco were too associated with previous rulers, too filled with populations that might resist Almoravid authority. He needed a new city, one that would be purely Almoravid from its foundation, strategically located to control both the mountain passes and the routes to the Atlantic coast. In 1062, Yusuf ibn Tashfin founded Marrakesh. The location was brilliant, a plain at the foot of the Atlas Mountains, with access to water from mountain streams, positioned between the Sahara to the south and the fertile regions of northern Morocco. Marrakesh began as a military camp, with simple structures and fortifications. But Yusuf envisioned something grander. He brought craftsmen from conquered cities, imported building materials, constructed mosques, palaces, fortifications, and markets. He planted extensive gardens, using sophisticated irrigation to create greenery in the dry plain. Marrakesh grew rapidly from camp to city to imperial capital, becoming the heart of Almoravid power and one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world. From Marrakesh, Yusuf launched systematic campaigns to conquer all of Morocco. City by city, valley by valley, mountain range by mountain range, the Almoravids extended their control. They captured Fez in 1069, the ancient intellectual center of Morocco, gaining not just a city, but legitimacy in the eyes of the broader Islamic world. They pushed to the Atlantic coast, conquering ports that would connect their desert empire to Mediterranean trade networks. They drove into the Atlas Mountains, subduing Berber tribes that had never submitted to any external authority. By 1070, Yusuf ibn Tashfin controlled virtually all of present-day Morocco, but his ambitions did not stop at natural borders. To the east lay the powerful Hammadid and Zirid dynasties controlling Algeria and Tunisia. Yusuf chose not to fight them directly; they were fellow Muslims, and such conflict would contradict Almoravid religious principles. Instead, he looked westward, across the narrow strait of water that separated Africa from Europe, toward Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, where opportunity and crisis beckoned. Al-Andalus, in the late 11th century, was a shadow of its former glory. Once the most brilliant civilization in Western Europe, home to universities, poets, scientists, and philosophers, Al-Andalus had fragmented into competing Taifa kingdoms, small states ruled by rival Muslim dynasties, more interested in fighting each other than in presenting a united front against the growing Christian kingdoms of northern Spain. These Taifa rulers paid tribute to Christian kings, hired Christian mercenaries, and fought wars against fellow Muslims. From the Almoravid perspective, this was shameful, a betrayal of Islamic unity and strength. Meanwhile, the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, and Aragon were growing stronger, pushing southward in what they called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from Muslim rule. In 1085, this Christian pressure reached a crisis point when Alfonso VI of Castile captured Toledo, one of the greatest cities of Al-Andalus, an ancient capital with symbolic importance far beyond its military value. The fall of Toledo sent shockwaves through the Muslim kingdoms of Spain. They suddenly realized that their divisions, their internal conflicts, and their weakness might lead to the complete loss of Al-Andalus to Christian conquest. The Taifa kings faced a terrible choice. They could continue fighting alone, divided, and likely be conquered piecemeal by the advancing Christian armies. Or they could invite the Almoravids to cross from Morocco to defend Al-Andalus, knowing that these fierce desert warriors might not be content to simply serve as hired defenders and then leave. Inviting the Almoravids was like inviting a lion into your house to chase away wolves. The wolves might leave, but the lion might decide to stay. In desperation, several Taifa rulers sent embassies to Marrakesh, pleading with Yusuf ibn Tashfin to cross the strait and save Islamic Spain from Christian conquest. Yusuf received these embassies with careful consideration. He consulted with religious scholars, with his military commanders, with merchants and advisors. Some counseled caution Spain was far from the Sahara, a different environment with different challenges. Others saw opportunity, the chance to save fellow Muslims, to acquire wealthy territories, to fulfill the Almoravid mission of unifying Islam under strict religious practice. Yusuf made his decision. He would cross into Al-Andalus, but not as a mercenary serving the Taifa kings. He would cross as a religious reformer and potential ruler, coming to save Islam in Spain, not just from Christian conquest, but also from what he saw as the moral decay and political weakness of the existing Muslim rulers. In 1086, at the age of approximately 65, Yusuf ibn Tashfin led an Almoravid army across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. The crossing was a massive logistical operation. Yusuf brought thousands of warriors, camels, horses, and supplies across the narrow strait, separating Africa from Europe. The Almoravid army that landed in Al-Andalus was unlike anything the Iberian Peninsula had seen. These were desert warriors, veiled and disciplined, fighting not for plunder or territory, but for religious principle. They brought with them war drums that pounded like heartbeats, creating psychological terror in enemies. They fought with curved swords and light cavalry tactics perfected in the Sahara. They moved with speed and coordination that European armies, used to heavy cavalry and infantry formations, found difficult to counter. Alfonso VI of Castile, hearing that a massive Muslim army from Africa had landed in Spain, gathered his own forces. He assembled a coalition of Christian knights, Castilian troops, and mercenaries. The two armies met on the 23rd of October 1086 at Sagrajas, called Zalaca in Arabic sources, near the fortress city of Badajoz in southwestern Spain. The Battle of Sagrajas would become one of the most significant military engagements of the medieval period, determining the future of the Iberian Peninsula for generations. The Christian army was formidable, heavily armored knights, experienced soldiers, led by a king who had been steadily conquering Muslim territories for years. Alfonso VI was confident, perhaps overconfident. He had defeated Muslim armies before, and he expected these African warriors, despite their numbers, to fall before the might of Castilian military power. He was catastrophically wrong. The battle began with traditional cavalry charges and infantry clashes. The Almoravid forces absorbed the Christian assault, giving ground but not breaking. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, commanding from behind the lines with the wisdom of an experienced general, had prepared a tactical surprise. While the main Almoravid force engaged the Christian army from the front, a large contingent of African cavalry, hidden and held in reserve, circled around the Christian position. As the battle reached its critical moment, these reserve forces crashed into the Christian rear, striking Alfonso's camp and supply lines. The Castilian army found itself attacked from two directions simultaneously. Confusion turned to panic. Soldiers who had been pushing forward suddenly found enemies behind them. The Almoravid war drums intensified, creating terrifying cacophony. The veiled warriors seemed to be everywhere at once, striking with desert speed and ferocity. Alfonso VI himself was wounded in the leg during the fighting, barely escaping with his life as his army disintegrated around him. The Christian forces fled in chaos, leaving thousands dead on the battlefield. The Battle of Sagrajas was a devastating Almoravid victory, one of the worst defeats Christian Spain had suffered in decades. But Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not pursue the retreating Christians deep into their territories. He did not attempt to conquer Christian Spain or push further north. Instead, showing the strategic restraint that characterized his leadership, he withdrew back across the strait to Morocco after only a few months in Spain. His stated reason was trouble brewing in the south of his empire, rebellions and conflicts that required his attention. But many historians believe he also wanted to see how the Taifa kings would behave. whether they would unite and strengthen themselves or continue their self-destructive rivalries. The Taifa rulers, predictably, returned to their old ways. They resumed fighting each other, continued paying tribute to Christian kings, and made no serious effort to reform or unify. Meanwhile, Alfonso VI, despite his defeat at Sagrajas, recovered and resumed his pressure on Muslim territories. By 1090, it was clear that the Taifa kingdoms could not defend Al-Andalus on their own, that their political fragmentation was terminal, and that Islamic Spain would fall to Christian conquest unless drastic action was taken. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, now in his late 60s, made a decision that would transform Al-Andalus forever. He would not merely defend the Taifa kingdoms, he would conquer them, removing the weak and divided rulers and incorporating their territories directly into the Almoravid Empire. He obtained religious authorization for this conquest from Islamic scholars, who issued fatwas declaring that the Taifa kings, through their tribute payments to Christian rulers and their failure to properly defend Islam, had forfeited their right to rule. Beginning in 1090, Yusuf launched a systematic campaign to conquer the Taifa kingdoms. One by one, they fell to Almoravid forces. Granada was annexed in 1090, Malaga shortly after, Seville in 1091, Badajoz in 1094, Valencia after the death of the legendary Christian mercenary El Cid in 1099, and finally Zaragoza in 1110, completing the Almoravid conquest of Islamic Spain. Some cities surrendered peacefully, recognizing the inevitability of Almoravid rule. Others resisted and were taken by force. The Taifa kings were deposed, their palaces occupied, their treasuries confiscated. Almoravid governors replaced local rulers, and strict Islamic law replaced the more relaxed practices of the previous regimes. By the end of the 11th century, Yusuf ibn Tashfin ruled an empire that stretched from the Senegal River in sub-Saharan Africa across the entire Sahara Desert, through all of Morocco and western Algeria, and into the heartland of Al-Andalus in Spain. This was one of the largest empires in the Islamic world at that time, comparable in extent to the Abbasid Caliphate's remaining territories in the east. But unlike the fragmented Abbasid state, the Almoravid Empire was unified, disciplined, and animated by religious purpose. Yusuf's capital at Marrakesh had grown into a magnificent city of perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, with grand mosques, busy markets, and fortifications that made it virtually impregnable. The administration of this vast empire required sophisticated governance. Yusuf established a hierarchical system with himself as Amir, prince, though he never claimed the title of Caliph out of respect for the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, the nominal leader of all Sunni Muslims. Below him were governors appointed to major cities and regions, always Almoravid loyalists, often members of the original Sanhaja tribes that had begun the movement. These governors wielded military and administrative power, but were watched carefully by religious scholars, qadis or judges, who ensured that Islamic law was properly implemented. The fusion of military, administrative, and religious authority created a governing system that was rigid but effective, harsh but stable. The Almoravid economy was based primarily on control of trans-Saharan trade. Gold from the mines of West Africa, from regions that would later become the Ghana and Mali empires, flowed through Almoravid territories on its way to the Mediterranean and Europe. Salt from Saharan mines traveled south to African kingdoms that valued it as highly as gold. Slaves, unfortunately and tragically, moved in both directions, captured in raids and wars, bought and sold in markets throughout the empire. The Almoravids levied taxes and customs duties on all this trade, generating enormous revenue that financed their military, their construction projects, and their administrative apparatus. In Al-Andalus, the Almoravids also benefited from the agricultural productivity of Iberian valleys, from tribute extracted from Christian territories, and from the sophisticated urban economies of cities like Seville, Granada, and Cordoba. They minted gold dinars that became respected currency throughout the Mediterranean world. Almoravid coins have been found as far away as Scandinavia, testimony to the extensive trade networks that connected this African empire to the wider medieval world. But the Almoravid Empire was built on more than economic foundation. It was an ideological project, an attempt to create a society governed purely by Islamic religious law as interpreted by Maliki scholars. Yusuf ibn Tashfin and his successors enforced strict religious practice across their territories. They banned musical instruments, considering them distractions from proper worship. They segregated men and women strictly in public spaces. They enforced modest dress codes, the wearing of veils, and regular attendance at mosques. They punished violations of Islamic law with harsh penalties, including public whippings, amputations, and executions. Christians and Jews living under Almoravid rule were subjected to the dhimmi system, allowed to practice their religions, but required to pay special taxes and accept subordinate social status. This religious strictness created tensions, especially in Al-Andalus, where Muslim society had developed a more cosmopolitan and culturally sophisticated character than the Almoravids considered proper. Andalusi Muslims drank wine, listened to music, wrote sensual poetry, and engaged in philosophical speculation. They had developed a refined court culture that blended Islamic traditions with influences from Christian and Jewish neighbors. The Almoravid conquest disrupted this cultural flowering. Many poets, musicians, and intellectuals fled to Christian territories or other parts of the Islamic world. Libraries were purged of books considered religiously suspect. Philosophical inquiry was constrained by religious orthodoxy. Yet despite this cultural conservatism, or perhaps because of it, the Almoravid period saw remarkable architectural and religious achievements. Yusuf ibn Tashfin and his successors commissioned the construction of magnificent mosques throughout their empire. The Great Mosque of Marrakesh, with its distinctive minaret, became a model for later Moroccan architecture. In Tlemcen, in Fez, in cities across the empire, Almoravid architects developed a distinctive style characterized by horseshoe arches, intricate geometric decorations, and austere beauty that reflected their religious values. These buildings were not merely houses of worship, they were statements of power, demonstrations that an empire born in the desert had achieved permanent civilizational status. Yusuf ibn Tashfin died in 1106 at the extraordinary age of approximately 100 years according to some sources, though most historians consider him to have been in his mid-80s. He had ruled the Almoravid Empire for more than 40 years as its supreme leader, transforming it from a desert confederation into one of the major powers of the medieval world. He died in his capital of Marrakesh and was buried simply in accordance with his austere religious beliefs, reportedly in an unmarked grave. His death marked not the end, but the apex of Almoravid power. Leadership passed to his son, Ali ibn Yusuf, who ruled from 1106 to 1143. Ali inherited an empire at its maximum territorial extent and continued his father's policies of strict religious governance and military vigilance. He successfully defended Al-Andalus against renewed Christian offensives, winning several important battles that preserved Muslim Spain for another generation. He expanded and beautified Marrakesh, constructing elaborate palaces and mosques that testified to the empire's wealth and power. Under Ali's rule, the Almoravid Empire appeared stable, prosperous, and permanent. But beneath this surface stability, cracks were forming. The very religious strictness that had united the empire in its early days was now generating resentment. In Al-Andalus, the urban population increasingly resented what they saw as primitive African religious zealots, suppressing their sophisticated culture. In Morocco, rival Berber tribes chafed under Sanhaja dominance, waiting for opportunities to rebel. In the Sahara, the original religious fervor of the movement was cooling as second and third generations of Almoravids came to maturity, born into power rather than conquering it, more interested in comfortable living than in jihad and religious purity. More dangerous still, a new religious movement was rising to challenge the Almoravids. In the mountains of southern Morocco, a scholar named Ibn Tumart began preaching a different interpretation of Islam, one that he claimed was purer and more authentic than Almoravid Maliki orthodoxy. Ibn Tumart called his followers the Almohads, the monotheists, arguing that the Almoravids had fallen into error and corruption, that they had betrayed the true teachings of Islam. It was a bitter irony the Almoravids, who had begun as religious reformers attacking what they saw as lax Islamic practice, were now themselves being attacked by new reformers, accusing them of religious deviation. The Almohad movement in its early years was small and seemed unlikely to threaten the powerful Almoravid Empire. But it was animated by the same religious fervor that had powered the Almoravid rise a century earlier. It attracted followers from Berber tribes that resented Almoravid dominance, from religious scholars who disagreed with Maliki interpretation, from ambitious warriors seeking glory and plunder. Most importantly, it emerged at precisely the moment when Almoravid power, though still formidable, was beginning to show signs of weakness. In Al-Andalus, the military situation was deteriorating. Alfonso VII of Castile and the rising Christian kingdoms were launching more effective offensives, capturing important fortresses and territories. The Almoravid armies, though still disciplined and brave, were no longer winning the decisive victories that had characterized Yusuf ibn Tashfin's era. Local Andalusi Muslims increasingly blamed their African rulers for military setbacks, forgetting that it was Almoravid intervention that had saved Al-Andalus from Christian conquest in the first place. Ali ibn Yusuf died in 1143, and leadership passed to his son Tashfin ibn Ali. The new Amir was well-meaning, but lacked the political wisdom and military skill of his grandfather. He faced immediate crises on multiple fronts. In Morocco, Almohad rebels were capturing territory and winning battles against Almoravid forces. In Al-Andalus, several cities rebelled against Almoravid rule, with local populations preferring independence or even submission to Christian kingdoms over continued rule by what they now saw as failing African overlords. In the Sahara, the trade routes that had funded the empire were disrupted by tribal conflicts. Tashfin ibn Ali tried desperately to hold the empire together. He led military campaigns personally, showing courage if not strategic brilliance. He attempted reforms, trying to address some of the popular grievances while maintaining core Almoravid religious principles. But the tide had turned against his dynasty. In 1145, Almohad forces captured several major cities in Morocco. In the same year, Tashfin ibn Ali was killed in battle against the Almohads near Oran in Algeria, dealing a devastating blow to Almoravid morale. Leadership passed briefly to two more Almoravid princes in rapid succession, Ibrahim ibn Tashfin and then Ishaq ibn Ali. But by this point, the empire was in terminal collapse. City after city in Morocco fell to the Almohads. In Al-Andalus, local rulers declared independence or submitted to Christian kingdoms. The remaining Almoravid forces retreated toward the coast, toward the last strongholds of their once great empire. The end came in 1147. The Almohads captured Marrakesh, the great capital that Yusuf ibn Tashfin had founded nearly a century earlier. The last Almoravid Amir, Ishaq ibn Ali, was killed either during the city's fall or shortly afterward. The Almohad leader, Abd al-Mu'min, entered Marrakesh in triumph and established his own dynasty as rulers of Morocco and soon after Al-Andalus. The Almoravid dynasty, which had risen from the desert to rule an empire stretching from Africa to Spain, ceased to exist after barely a century of power. Some Almoravid remnants fled to the Balearic Islands off the Spanish coast, where they maintained a small independent state for a few more decades, the last fragment of their empire, before being finally conquered by Christian forces in the 1232. A few Almoravid nobles and soldiers accepted service with the Almohads or with Christian kingdoms. Many simply disappeared into the population, their distinctive veils removed, their imperial pretensions abandoned, their descendants absorbed into the societies that succeeded them. The legacy of the Almoravid Empire, however, did not disappear with their political collapse. They had demonstrated that African power could extend beyond the Sahara, that desert warriors could conquer sophisticated urban civilizations, that religious motivation could build empires. They established Marrakesh, which would remain one of North Africa's great cities for centuries, later serving as capital for other Moroccan dynasties. They preserved Islamic rule in Al-Andalus for more than half a century longer than would otherwise have been possible, allowing the cultural achievements of Muslim Spain to continue flowering, producing poetry, philosophy, and architecture that would influence all of medieval Europe. The Almoravids also established trade networks and administrative structures that their successors, the Almohads and later the Marinids and Sardians, would inherit and build upon. They created military traditions of disciplined cavalry warfare that influenced North African and Iberian military practices for generations. They demonstrated the power of combining religious ideology with military organization, a model that later Islamic dynasties throughout the world would study and attempt to replicate. Their architectural legacy endures in the mosques, fortifications, and urban layouts they created throughout Morocco and Spain. The distinctive Moroccan style of geometric decoration, horseshoe arches, and austere beauty that characterizes historic buildings in cities like Fez, Marrakesh, and parts of Seville owes much to Almoravid artistic vision. These were builders as well as warriors, empire makers who understood that lasting power required not just military conquest, but cultural and architectural monuments. Perhaps most significantly, the Almoravids demonstrated the crucial role that control of the Sahara played in medieval African and Mediterranean geopolitics. They proved that whoever controlled the desert's trade routes, the gold caravans, the salt commerce, the movement of goods between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world could accumulate the wealth and power to influence the fate of kingdoms and empires, far from the desert itself. This lesson was not lost on future empire builders, including the rulers of Mali, who would emerge as the dominant Saharan power after Almoravid and Almohad decline. The story of the Almoravid dynasty raises profound questions about the nature of power, faith, and empire in the medieval world. How did a small group of religious zealots in a desert ribat become the rulers of territories stretching across thousands of miles? What combination of military skill, religious ideology, political timing, and leadership made their spectacular rise possible? And why, after such dramatic success, did their empire collapse so quickly and completely? Part of the answer lies in understanding the unique circumstances of the 11th and 12th centuries in the Islamic West. This was a period of fragmentation and crisis, when older political structures were breaking down and new forces were emerging. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had once unified much of the Islamic world, was weak and unable to project power into North Africa or Spain. Local dynasties in the Maghreb were fighting among themselves. Al-Andalus was splintered into competing taifas. Christian Europe was organizing crusades and reconquests. Into this power vacuum stepped the Almoravids, offering something that no other force could provide: military strength combined with religious legitimacy, unity enforced by faith, and leadership that commanded respect through both spiritual authority and political wisdom. Yusuf ibn Tashfin's genius was recognizing that the religious movement could become a political empire, that the energy of reform could be channeled into conquest, that strict ideology could serve as the foundation for administrative structure. He understood that an empire needed more than military victories. It needed capitals and cities, governance and law, economic foundations and cultural legitimacy. He built all of these while maintaining the austere religious character that had sparked the movement in the first place. But this religious foundation was also the empire's fatal weakness. The very strictness that unified the early Almoravids eventually alienated populations they ruled, especially in sophisticated urban centers like those of Al-Andalus. The uncompromising nature of their ideology made adaptation difficult when circumstances changed. And most critically, their religious legitimacy made them vulnerable to new religious movements that could claim even greater purity, as the Almohads successfully did. The Almoravids also illustrate the challenges of multi-generational imperial rule. Yusuf ibn Tashfin and the first generation of leaders were extraordinary individuals who had earned power through merit, courage, and vision. But their children and grandchildren inherited empire without experiencing the struggles that created it. They were raised in palaces, not desert camps, trained in comfort, not hardship. This generational decline is a common pattern in dynastic history, but it was particularly acute for the Almoravids because their empire's foundation was religious fervor, which is notoriously difficult to maintain across generations. The military challenges the later Almoravids faced should not be underestimated. They were fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously against rising Christian powers in Spain, against Almohad rebels in Morocco, against tribal resistance in the Sahara. Even the most capable leadership would have struggled with this three-front conflict. The fact that they maintained control for as long as they did testifies to the institutional strength that Yusuf ibn Tashfin had built into the empire's structures. It is also worth noting what the Almoravids were not. They were not primarily interested in conquest for territorial expansion or plunder. Their military campaigns were ideologically motivated, aimed at religious unification rather than imperial aggrandizement. They did not seek to destroy or displace the populations they conquered, but rather to reform them, to enforce what they considered proper Islamic practice. This religious focus distinguished them from many other medieval conquerors and explains both their rapid rise. Populations sometimes welcomed their promise of justice and order, and their eventual fall when their religious strictness became oppressive. The Almoravid relationship with sub-Saharan Africa deserves particular attention because it is often overlooked in histories that focus on their North African and Spanish conquests. The empire's southern territories in the Sahara and its trade relationships with kingdoms to the south were crucial to Almoravid power. The gold that financed their armies, their architecture, and their administration came from African mines beyond the desert. The slaves that formed part of their military forces and domestic economies came from raids and trade south of the Sahara. The camels that made their armies mobile were bred and managed using knowledge from desert African peoples. The Almoravids were fundamentally an African empire, rooted in Saharan geography and culture, even when they conquered northward into Morocco and Spain. This African identity was both strength and challenge. It gave them military and economic advantages that Mediterranean-based powers lacked. But it also marked them as outsiders in Al-Andalus, where sophisticated urban Muslims looked down on what they perceived as primitive Africans, imposing themselves on cultured European civilization. This cultural prejudice, combining racial and regional biases, weakened Almoravid legitimacy in Spain and contributed to the rebellions that undermined their rule there. The speed of the Almoravid collapse after more than a century of power is striking. Within less than a decade, from about 1140 to 1147, the entire empire disintegrated. This rapid decline suggests that the empire's apparent stability in the early 12th century was more fragile than it appeared, held together more by habit and administrative inertia than by genuine loyalty or institutional strength. When serious military defeats exposed this fragility, the empire could not recover. Yet in understanding the Almoravid legacy, we must look beyond the dynasty's political collapse to its longer-term historical impacts. The Almoravids demonstrated that Islamic civilization could be revitalized through movement from the periphery, that new energy and leadership could emerge from unexpected places, in this case, the Sahara Desert, to reshape the core regions of Islamic power. This pattern would repeat throughout Islamic history, with successive waves of conquest and renewal coming from frontier regions and nomadic peoples, bringing fresh vigor to urban civilizations. The Almoravids also played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting knowledge and culture. Despite their religious conservatism, their empire served as a conduit for ideas, goods, and people moving between Africa, Spain, and the broader Mediterranean world. Scholars traveled within their territories, carrying manuscripts and learning between cities. Merchants connected African gold to European markets, facilitating economic connections that sustained medieval commerce. Architectural and artistic styles developed under Almoravid patronage influenced subsequent Islamic art throughout the Western Mediterranean. Their military legacy endured as well. The tactics and organizational structures the Almoravids developed the use of light cavalry in combination with disciplined infantry, the integration of religious motivation into military training. The logistics of moving large armies across desert and mountain terrain were studied and adapted by later rulers. The Almohads who conquered them learned from Almoravid military methods even as they fought against them. In the broader sweep of African history, the Almoravids occupy a significant but often underappreciated position. They represent the only medieval dynasty to simultaneously control significant territories in sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Europe. They were the bridge that connected the gold kingdoms of West Africa to the intellectual centers of Islamic Spain, facilitating exchanges of goods, ideas, and culture across regions that are often studied in isolation from each other. By controlling the Sahara, they demonstrated that the desert was not a barrier separating Africa from the Mediterranean world, but rather a highway connecting them. A bridge that required special knowledge and capability to cross, but one that, once mastered, offered extraordinary advantages. The Almoravid story also illuminates the complexity of religious reform movements and their relationship to political power. They began as authentic spiritual reformers, genuinely believing that they were purifying Islam and creating a more just society. But as their movement gained political power, it inevitably became entangled with worldly concerns, with taxation and administration, with military conquest and economic exploitation, with the compromises and moral ambiguities that governing requires. This transformation from religious purity to political pragmatism is visible in comparing the early Almoravids living in their Ribat with the later Almoravid emirs ruling from palaces in Marrakesh. The ideals remained, the rhetoric continued, but the reality had changed substantially. This tension between religious idealism and political reality ultimately made the Almoravids vulnerable to the Almohad challenge. When a new generation of reformers emerged claiming greater purity and authenticity, pointing to the gap between Almoravid ideals and practices, the empire had difficulty defending itself ideologically. They could not claim to be religious reformers while simultaneously defending the political and economic privileges they had accumulated. They could not preach austerity while living in luxurious palaces. This ideological vulnerability proved as dangerous as any military threat. For modern observers, the Almoravid Empire offers important lessons about the role of ideology in empire building, the challenges of maintaining cohesion across culturally diverse territories, and the difficulties of sustaining revolutionary energy across multiple generations. Their story also reminds us that Africa has produced sophisticated empires and complex civilizations throughout history, that African political and military leadership has shaped the development of Europe and the Mediterranean world, not just been shaped by it. The scholarly study of the Almoravids has been hampered by limited sources. They left fewer written records than some other Islamic dynasties, partly because their culture emphasized oral tradition and religious practice over literary production, partly because many of their records were destroyed in the wars that brought them down. Most of what we know comes from accounts written by their enemies, Christian chronicles, Almohad historians, and Andalusi writers who resented Almoravid rule. These sources must be read critically, recognizing their biases and limitations. Recent archaeological work in Morocco, particularly in Marrakesh and other Almoravid cities, is gradually revealing more about how they lived, what they built, and how their society functioned. Excavations of Almoravid-era buildings, analysis of their coins and material culture, and study of trade goods found in archaeological contexts are providing evidence that complements and sometimes challenges the written sources. This archaeological data is particularly valuable for understanding the lives of ordinary people under Almoravid rule, not just the elites whose actions dominate the chronicles. The Almoravid legacy lives on in the physical landscape of Morocco and parts of Spain, in the genetic heritage of populations descended from their soldiers and subjects, in cultural practices and traditions that trace back to their period of rule, and in the historical memory of communities across North Africa and the Sahara. For the modern nations that occupy territories once ruled by the Almoravids, Morocco, Mauritania, Mali, Senegal, Algeria, and Spain, this history forms part of national narratives, though often interpreted differently depending on contemporary political and cultural perspectives. In Morocco, the Almoravids are generally viewed positively as the founders of Marrakesh and as a powerful native dynasty that resisted foreign influence and built an impressive empire. They are celebrated as part of the country's glorious past, as examples of Moroccan military prowess and political sophistication. In Mali and Mauritania, they represent an early chapter in the complex history of Saharan empires and trade networks, precursors to the more famous Mali Empire that would dominate trans-Saharan commerce in later centuries. In Spain, their legacy is more contested, seen both as foreign invaders who imposed religious strictness on Al-Andalus and as the defenders who preserved Islamic civilization in the peninsula for another crucial period. The religious aspects of Almoravid history continue to resonate in contemporary debates about the proper relationship between Islamic faith and political power, about the role of religious law in governance, and about the tension between ideological purity and political pragmatism. Some modern Islamic movements look to the early Almoravids as a model of how religious revival can create political change and social transformation. Others point to the Almoravid experience as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive religious zeal and the inevitable corruption that comes with political power. The Almoravids' African identity is particularly significant in an era of growing recognition that African history extends far beyond the narrow narratives that once dominated Western historiography. For too long, African history was either ignored entirely or treated as peripheral to the supposedly more important developments in Europe and the Middle East. The Almoravid Empire demonstrates conclusively that Africa has produced sophisticated states capable of projecting power across continents, that African rulers and warriors shaped the course of European history, and that African economic resources, particularly the gold that flowed from West African mines, were crucial to the functioning of medieval Mediterranean civilizations. The story of how Berber desert nomads became emperors, ruling from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, from sub-Saharan Africa to the heart of Spain, is fundamentally a story about human capability, ambition, and the complex forces that drive historical change. It is a story about how belief systems can mobilize populations and create political movements, how military innovation and leadership can overcome apparent disadvantages of numbers and resources, how control of trade routes and economic networks can translate into political power, and how empires rise and fall according to patterns that recur throughout human history. The Almoravids ruled their empire for approximately a century, a substantial period but shorter than many other major dynasties. In that century, they changed the political map of North Africa and Spain, preserved Islamic civilization in Al-Andalus for crucial decades, facilitated trade and cultural exchange across vast distances, built cities and monuments that still stand today, and left a mark on history that scholars are still working to fully understand and appreciate. They demonstrated that an empire could emerge from the Sahara Desert, that African leadership could shape the destiny of European territories, and that religious ideology, combined with military skill, could create a political force capable of conquering kingdoms and building civilization. But beyond the dates and battles, the conquests and collapses, the Almoravid story speaks to something deeper about human nature and historical forces. It reminds us that no empire is permanent, that even the most powerful states eventually fall, that success contains the seeds of future failure. The very qualities that made the Almoravids successful, their religious fervor, their military discipline, their austere lifestyle, eventually became limitations as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. Their story also reminds us of the contingent nature of history, how individual decisions and personalities shape the course of events in unpredictable ways. If Abdallah ibn Yasin had not accepted the invitation to preach in the Sahara, if Yusuf ibn Tashfin had not possessed the combination of military skill and political wisdom that he did, if the Taifa kings of Al-Andalus had been more capable of defending themselves, if the Almohad movement had not emerged when it did, any of these changes might have produced a radically different historical outcome. The Almoravid Empire was not inevitable. It was the product of specific circumstances, particular individuals, and fortuitous timing. Yet within that contingency, we can also see patterns that recur throughout history, the cycle of tribal confederation, leading to empire, leading to decline, the generational transition from revolutionary founders to inheriting children who lack their parents' drive, the tension between religious idealism and political compromise, the challenge of maintaining cohesion across culturally diverse territories, the vulnerability of empires to new movements that can claim greater purity or legitimacy. These patterns suggest that while individual events are contingent, the broader forces shaping history have a certain logic and predictability. For the people who lived under Almoravid rule, the empire meant different things depending on their position and perspective. For the original Sanhaja warriors, it meant the transformation from nomadic poverty to imperial power, from wandering the desert with herds to governing cities and collecting taxes. For the urban populations of Morocco, it meant the imposition of order after a period of fragmentation, the construction of new cities and economic opportunities, but also the enforcement of religious rules that constrained behavior. For the people of Al-Andalus, it meant rescue from Christian conquest, but also the end of their cultural autonomy, the suppression of their artistic and intellectual traditions, the rule of foreigners who looked down on their sophistication as corruption. For the Christians and Jews living under Almoravid rule, it meant continued but constrained existence as dhimmis, protected but subordinate peoples whose rights were respected according to Islamic law, but whose opportunities were limited and whose status was always inferior to Muslims. The Almoravids were not particularly more or less tolerant than other medieval Muslim states, but their strict religious ideology left little room for the kind of cultural exchange and philosophical dialogue that had characterized some earlier periods of Islamic rule in Spain. For the women of the empire, evidence is scarce, but suggests that Almoravid's strictness regarding gender segregation and veiling was enforced more rigorously than in many other Islamic societies of the period. Elite women of the founding Sanhaja tribes apparently retained some influence, with some sources mentioning queens and princesses who were consulted on important matters. But ordinary women faced significant restrictions on their movement, their dress, and their participation in public life. For slaves, who were numerous in Almoravid society, as in most medieval civilizations, life was generally harsh, though practices varied depending on whether one was a domestic slave in an urban household, an agricultural slave on estates, or a military slave trained for warfare. Some military slaves could rise to positions of responsibility and relative comfort. Most others endured lives of toil with no hope of freedom. The economic impact of Almoravid rule on the territories they controlled was mixed. The unification of such a vast area under single political authority facilitated trade and reduced the transaction costs and risks associated with moving goods across political boundaries. Merchants could travel from sub-Saharan Africa to Spain with greater security than before. But Almoravid taxation was heavy. Their religious restrictions sometimes disrupted profitable activities, and their military campaigns required constant mobilization of resources. Different regions and different social classes experienced these effects differently. The environmental impact of the Almoravid Empire is a less studied but interesting aspect of their history. The concentration of population in cities like Marrakesh required sophisticated water management systems, drawing on desert and mountain water sources. The constant movement of large armies and trade caravans across the Sahara affected vegetation patterns and animal populations. The expansion of agriculture in some regions to feed growing urban populations altered landscapes. These environmental changes, though less dramatic than those of modern industrial societies, were nonetheless significant and shaped the ecology of the regions they controlled. As we reach the end of this historical narrative, it is worth reflecting on why the Almoravids deserve to be remembered and studied despite being less famous than other medieval Islamic dynasties or African empires. They matter because they represent a crucial link between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world, because they preserved Islamic civilization in Spain during a critical period, because they built architectural and cultural legacies that endure, because they demonstrate patterns of rise and fall that illuminate how empires function, and because their story is simply fascinating, a tale of desert warriors who became emperors, of religious zealots who built sophisticated urban civilization, of African power projecting into Europe at a time when European histories often ignore African agency entirely. The Almoravids also matter because they complicate simplistic narratives about medieval history. They challenge the idea that European Christian powers were always expanding and Muslim powers always retreating during this period. They demonstrate that African societies were not isolated from global historical processes, but actively shaping them. They show that religious ideology could be a source of political power rather than merely a tool manipulated by cynical rulers. They reveal the complexity and sophistication of medieval North African and Saharan societies, countering stereotypes that portray these regions as backward or primitive. For modern audiences, seeking to understand the deep history of regions that remain geopolitically important today, Morocco, the Sahel, West Africa, the Western Mediterranean, the Almoravid Empire provides essential context. The trade routes they controlled still matter, now carrying different goods, but following similar paths. The cities they built remain important urban centers. The cultural exchanges they facilitated left linguistic, genetic, and cultural traces that persist. The political and religious questions they grappled with about the relationship between faith and power, about how to govern diverse populations, about how to maintain cohesion across vast distances, remain relevant. In the final analysis, the Almoravid dynasty ruled the Sahara and beyond for a century of extraordinary historical significance. They emerged from the desert with nothing but faith, courage, and vision, and they built an empire that stretched across continents. They rescued Islamic Spain from Christian conquest, unified North Africa under single rule for the first time in centuries, connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world through controlled trade networks, built cities and monuments that endured long after their political power collapsed, and demonstrated that Africa could produce empires equal to any in the medieval world. They rose dramatically, ruled effectively for a time, and fell quickly, but their impact on the history of Africa, Europe, and the Islamic world was profound and lasting. Before Mali, before the great West African empires that would dominate later centuries, the Almoravids proved that power could emerge from the Sahara, that desert warriors could become emperors, and that African might could reshape the medieval world. Their story deserves to be remembered, studied, and told.